Man, that poor pilot got screwed. All he did was survive and is getting punished for it. That comment. You've seen versions of it in every Star Wars thread that digs beneath the surface. Maybe you wrote one yourself. And you weren't wrong. You weren't even close to wrong. Because what happened after the Death Star exploded, what the Empire did to the people who served it, who built it, who survived it, makes everything the rebellion faced look like a slap on the wrist. The Empire didn't reserve its cruelty for enemies. It saved the worst for its own. This isn't a lore video. This is a case file. And by the end, you'll understand why dying at Yavin was the best thing that could have happened to anyone wearing an Imperial uniform that day. Let's start with the one man who got lucky. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin stood on that command bridge with absolute certainty in his chest. The Battle of Yavin unfolded in 0 BBY. Rebel snubfighters screaming through trenches, turbolaser batteries swiveling too slowly, and Tarkin watching it all with the confidence of a man who'd built his entire doctrine around the idea that overwhelming force rendered resistance meaningless. 14 years. That's how long the Death Star took to construct. 14 years of resources drained from 1,000 star systems. 14 years of Tarkin's career invested in a single proposition, that terror, applied at sufficient scale, could make rebellion impossible. The destruction of Alderaan, mere hours before, had been his proof of concept. 2 billion people vaporized as a demonstration. Not because Alderaan posed a military threat, because Tarkin wanted the galaxy to watch a planet die and understand that resistance meant extinction. And now, 30 snubfighters were trying to destroy his monument to fear. When subordinates suggested evacuating command personnel to nearby star destroyers as the attack developed, Tarkin's response has been reconstructed from the handful of officers who survived aboard those distant vessels. Evacuate? In our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances. That wasn't tactical assessment. That was arrogance functioning as suicide by certainty. Tarkin couldn't conceive of the Death Star failing because failure would invalidate everything he'd spent 14 years building. The doctrine of rule through terror. The conviction that resistance was meaningless. The political capital he'd spent convincing Palpatine to dissolve the Imperial Senate and rule through regional governors backed by planet-killing firepower. If the Death Star could be destroyed by a handful of fighters, then Tarkin's entire philosophy was wrong. And Tarkin would rather die than be wrong. The proton torpedo hit the thermal exhaust port. The reactor went critical. Over 1 million Imperial personnel vaporized in a single cataclysmic detonation. Gunners and pilots and technicians and stormtroopers and officers and maintenance workers and mess hall cooks and medical staff. 1 million lives ended in the microsecond between reactor criticality and molecular dispersal. And Tarkin? Tarkin was granted the only mercy available to Imperial servants. Death before Palpatine's judgment could arrive. In that final microsecond, Tarkin was still Grand Moff, still confident, still convinced the Empire was invincible. He never saw the Emperor's face twist with rage. He never felt mechanical fingers close around his throat via hologram. He never woke up in a cloning tank with the memory of how he died. That matters. That matters more than you might think. Because what followed in the days and weeks and years after Yavin reveals that Tarkin's instantaneous death was the best possible outcome for anyone associated with the Empire's greatest failure. Everyone who survived would face something far worse than clean annihilation. They would face Palpatine's creativity. But before we get to the torture chambers, let's talk about the one man who did everything right. General Cassio Tagge. You remember him from A New Hope, even if you don't remember his name. He's the officer at that conference table who actually understood the threat. While Tarkin dismissed the Rebel Alliance and Admiral Moti sneered at Vader's sad devotion to that ancient religion, Tagge was the voice of reason. He warned them, explicitly, on screen. Until this battle station is fully operational, we are vulnerable. The Rebel Alliance is too well equipped. They're more dangerous than you realize. Tarkin overruled him. Moti mocked him. And then the Death Star exploded exactly the way Tagge predicted it might. Here's the thing about Tagge. He wasn't on the Death Star when it blew. He was aboard a separate Star Destroyer, watching from a safe distance as Tarkin's arrogance became a debris field. By every rational metric, Tagge should have been vindicated. He'd raised concerns. He'd been ignored. He'd been proven catastrophically correct. And Palpatine noticed. In the immediate aftermath of Yavin, while Vader was being dismantled and Lemlisk was being devoured by beetles, Cassio Tagge received a promotion. Grand General, the highest military rank in the Empire. Palpatine placed him in charge of Imperial military operations, effectively making him the replacement for the dead Tarkin. The man who'd been right was rewarded with authority. Sounds like a happy ending, doesn't it? It wasn't. The 2015 Marvel Comics Darth Vader series, written by Kieran Gillen, chronicles what happened next. Tagge was promoted, yes, but he was also handed an impossible mandate. Fix the Empire's military after its greatest humiliation. Rebuild confidence. Restore fear. And do it all while navigating a court where Palpatine trusted no one, and Vader was looking for someone to blame. Tagge spent the months after Yavin in perpetual paranoia. Every decision second-guessed. Every failure, no matter how small, potentially fatal. He watched officers around him die for minor infractions and understood that his promotion hadn't protected him. It had painted a target on his back. The Gillen comics show Tagge clashing repeatedly with Vader. The Grand General tried to marginalize the Sith Lord, to prove that conventional military leadership could succeed where Vader's mysticism had failed. Vader, meanwhile, was looking for any opportunity to eliminate a rival and restore his own standing with the Emperor. Darth Vader issue number 25 documents how it ended. Tagge failed to capture Luke Skywalker. A significant failure, but hardly unique. Half the Imperial military had failed to capture Luke Skywalker by that point. But Vader saw his opening. He reported the failure to Palpatine with appropriate theatrical disappointment. And the Emperor, always willing to dispose of useful tools once they'd served their purpose, gave Vader permission to handle the situation. Tagge didn't die quickly like Tarkin. He didn't get the mercy of instant vaporization. He died knowing that being right hadn't saved him. Being promoted hadn't saved him. Being the only competent voice in that conference room hadn't saved him. The Empire didn't reward correctness. It rewarded survival. And then it punished survival anyway. Darth Vader emerged from the Death Star's destruction in his TIE Advanced X-1, spiraling through debris fields, regaining control, rendezvousing with Imperial forces near Yavin. By any military standard, his survival represented a victory. The Empire's second-in-command had escaped an enemy attack that killed 1 million of his subordinates. He'd personally shot down multiple rebel pilots during the trench run. He'd nearly stopped Luke Skywalker's fatal torpedo shot before the Millennium Falcon intervened. By Palpatine's standard, his survival represented an opportunity for instruction. Within days of the battle, Vader arrived at the Imperial Palace on Coruscant to deliver his report. What he received in return was documented in the 2015 Marvel Comics Darth Vader series. Palpatine had Vader's mechanical arm removed. Think about that for a second. Really think about it. Anakin Skywalker had lost his right arm on Geonosis in 22 BBY, severed by Count Dooku during the Clone Wars. He lost his remaining 3 limbs on Mustafar in 19 BBY, burned alive by lava flows after his duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi. By the time of Yavin, Vader was a quadruple amputee, every limb already replaced with Imperial machinery. His body was more prosthetic than flesh. His survival depended entirely on the life support systems built into his armor. And Palpatine took something that was already mechanical, which made the punishment worse in its own way. The Emperor wasn't destroying Vader's remaining flesh. He was disassembling his servant like a broken droid, demonstrating that even the mechanical parts keeping Vader functional belonged to Palpatine and could be revoked at will. Every servo, every joint, every breath Vader took through his respirator, all of it existed at the Emperor's pleasure. The humiliation was deliberate, theatrical. Vader, the terror of the galaxy, the enforcer who made admirals tremble and rebel cells scatter at the mention of his name, reduced to a partial cripple, while technicians reattached his arm under the Emperor's supervision. Standing there incomplete while Palpatine watched, the message was unmistakable. You are property, and I will take you apart whenever I choose. But the punishment didn't stop with dismemberment. Palpatine was already auditioning replacements. The Gillen comics introduced Dr. Silo, a cybernetics genius who'd been working for Palpatine in secret for years. While Vader was being punished, Silo was presenting his creations to the Emperor, genetically enhanced warriors with mechanical augmentations. Morit and Iolan Astarte, twins engineered for combat, enhanced with cybernetics, trained specifically to one day replace Vader as Palpatine's enforcer. Let that sink in. While Vader was having his arm reattached, while he was being exiled to Mustafar, Palpatine was literally showing him the competition. These are the beings who might take your place if you fail me again. Silo's candidates weren't hypothetical. They went on missions alongside Vader. They competed for the Emperor's favor. They were physical manifestations of Vader's expendability, walking reminders that 20 years of service meant nothing, that the second most powerful being in the galaxy could be replaced by laboratory-grown alternatives if he didn't perform. The comics and supplementary sources describe Vader's forced isolation at his fortress on Mustafar, that volcanic hellscape where he'd lost everything human about himself nearly 2 decades prior. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. This was calculated psychological torture. Palpatine sent Vader back to the place where Padme died, where Obi-Wan left him burning on a lava bank, where he'd screamed his hatred at the sky while his flesh charred and his lungs filled with ash. For weeks during the immediate post-Yavin period, Vader remained isolated on Mustafar while the Emperor reorganized military command structures around him, promoting Tagge, entertaining Silo's replacements, stripping Vader of fleet authority, assigning him missions beneath his station. 20 years of service, hunting Jedi, crushing insurgencies, terrorizing the galaxy, provided no insulation from immediate retribution. The timeline places Vader's rehabilitation and return to full active command at 2 to 3 months after Yavin. When he emerged from Mustafar, his authority was diminished. His position within the Imperial hierarchy was uncertain. Silo's creations were still competing for his role, and his understanding of his own expendability was absolute. If Palpatine would dismantle the second most powerful being in the galaxy for permitting a rebel victory, what hope did anyone else have? Yet Vader, for all his suffering, received mercy compared to others. At least he only died once. Bevel Lemlisk. Say that name to anyone who's dug into the extended universe and watch their face change. Watch the recognition, the disbelief, the slow dawning horror as they remember what the Empire did to its own chief engineer. This is the story that generates comment threads with hundreds of replies. This is the one fans can't stop talking about. And once you hear it, you'll understand why. Lemlisk served as chief designer of the original Death Star. He oversaw the superlaser integration, the technology that could crack a planet's core and scatter its mass across space. He managed the final construction phases, the transformation of theoretical schematics into operational superweapon. 14 years of his life poured into a single project. He wasn't a military officer, wasn't a Sith adherent, wasn't an ideological crusader for the New Order. He was an engineer who took the most prestigious contract available in the galaxy and delivered a functional, planet-killing battle station. His reward for that service began within weeks of the Battle of Yavin. Kevin J. Anderson's Darksaber novel, published by Bantam Spectra in 1995, documents what happened next. Summoned before Emperor Palpatine in the early months of 0 ABY, Lemlisk learned that his expertise was still required. The Empire would construct a second Death Star. It would correct the flaws that doomed the first, and Lemlisk would design it. This might have seemed like professional vindication, a second chance, proof that Palpatine valued his skills enough to overlook the first station's destruction. Instead, it marked the beginning of a torture program without parallel in galactic history. Palpatine had mastered Sith techniques, allowing consciousness transfer between clone bodies. He maintained backup vessels for his own eventual resurrection, insurance policies against assassination, against accident, against the inevitable betrayal that Sith philosophy practically guaranteed. And he used this technology on Bevel Lemlisk to create a punishment from which death itself provided no escape. The first execution came immediately, right there in the audience chamber. No warning, no trial, no opportunity to explain or defend himself. Palpatine had Lemlisk sealed in a containment unit filled with piranha beetles. Small, ravenous insects engineered to strip flesh from bone with methodical efficiency. The kind of creature that exists only in nightmares, or in the laboratories of a Sith Lord with unlimited resources and a talent for cruelty. Lemlisk experienced himself being devoured alive, every nerve ending firing agony signals as the beetles consumed his skin, starting at his extremities, working inward. He felt them reach his face, felt them burrow toward his skull, felt the unbearable sensation of being eaten while still conscious, still screaming, still aware of every mandible and every bite. He died in that chamber, horribly, completely. Then he woke up in a cloning facility. His consciousness had been transferred to a fresh body, every memory of the beetle's feast perfectly intact. The trauma wasn't erased, it was preserved, downloaded into new neurons, made permanent. He remembered dying. He remembered every second of being consumed. And now he was alive again, whole and undamaged, with Palpatine waiting beside his recovery pod. The Emperor explained that the second Death Star required Lemlisk's full dedication, and that any perceived hesitation would result in additional lessons. The Darksaber documentation confirms that Lemlisk was executed at least 7 times between 0 ABY and the Empire's fall at Endor in 4 ABY. Once as initial punishment, 6 additional times whenever Palpatine perceived insufficient enthusiasm or progress in Death Star 2 development. Each execution employed different methodology, as if the Emperor was conducting systematic research into varieties of dying. The burning followed the beetles. Lemlisk was sealed in a thermal chamber and cooked over hours. Not a quick incineration, a slow roasting. His skin blistering first, then splitting. Fat rendering beneath the surface. Screams continuing until his vocal cords charred to silence while his brain remained aware. He woke in another clone body. The memory of roasting layered atop the memory of being eaten. Vacuum exposure came next. Lemlisk ejected into hard space without a suit, experiencing the crystallization of his tissues from the outside inward, blood becoming ice in his veins, eyeballs freezing solid, saliva boiling off his tongue in the vacuum. His brain remained conscious long enough. The human brain can survive about 15 seconds of hard vacuum before losing consciousness, to comprehend each stage of his own termination. He woke up again. 3 deaths now. 3 complete experiences of dying, layered in his memory like sediment. Drowning, lungs filling with fluid while he thrashed against restraints. The primal panic of suffocation, that desperate mammalian need for air, extending for minutes that felt like hours. His body fighting to survive, while his mind knew there was no escape. The final surrender when the carbon dioxide buildup became too much and his diaphragm stopped trying. Crushing. The details are sparse in the sources, as if even the documentation found this one difficult to describe. Slow pressure, bones breaking sequentially, organs failing under compression, poisoning, something that took time, something that let him feel his body shutting down system by system. Methods the sources describe only obliquely, as if detailed recounting was unbearable, even for the archivists who recorded Imperial history. Each death left its full experiential residue in Lemlisk's memory. Trauma layered upon trauma until the engineer existed in permanent post-traumatic anticipation. He couldn't escape through death because Palpatine would resurrect him. He couldn't escape through sabotage because any slowdown resulted in another session. He couldn't escape through suicide because the cloning technology meant his consciousness would survive any self-inflicted termination. For 4 years, the entire construction period of Death Star 2 from 0 ABY to 4 ABY, Bevel Lemlisk worked under these conditions. Every morning might bring a summons to another execution chamber. Every design decision carried the weight of potential death and resurrection if Palpatine found it wanting. Every interaction with subordinates, every progress report, every minor setback could trigger the punishment cycle. The man who'd spent 14 years building the first Death Star now understood exactly what Imperial service meant. Your expertise keeps you alive only until your employer decides that dying would teach you something useful. After the Empire's collapse at Endor, Lemlisk was eventually captured by New Republic forces and tried for war crimes in 12 ABY. The tribunal convicted him of complicity in Alderaan's destruction. The weapon he designed had killed 2 billion people, and sentenced him to execution by firing squad. According to accounts from witnesses present at his final moments, Lemlisk faced the squad with something approaching peace, relief even. His last words acknowledged that after dying 7 times at Palpatine's hands, a simple blaster bolt felt like a gift. The New Republic, seeking justice, accidentally provided mercy. They thought they were punishing a war criminal. They were giving him the only thing he'd wanted for 12 years, a death that would actually stick. The cruelest punishment in galactic history came not from the Empire's enemies, but from the Empire itself. But here's the thing. Lemlisk wasn't special. He wasn't punished because he'd done something uniquely terrible. He was punished because that's what the Empire did. The documented pattern proves it. Lemlisk just happened to be valuable enough that Palpatine wanted to keep him working while also making him suffer. Most Imperial personnel weren't that lucky. The films themselves document the Empire's institutional response to failure with brutal clarity. Admiral Ozzel. You remember him from The Empire Strikes Back, commanding officer of Vader's flagship, the Executor, a career military man who'd risen through the ranks to command the most powerful warship in the Imperial fleet. He died via force choke for dropping the fleet out of hyperspace too close to Hoth. That's it. That's the entire crime. He emerged from hyperspace at a distance that alerted rebel sensors, giving the Alliance time to raise their planetary shield and begin evacuation procedures. A tactical error. Arguably not even his error. Hyperspace calculations involve entire navigation teams. But someone had to be blamed, and Vader crushed his windpipe via hologram while the Admiral gasped and clutched at his throat. This was 3 ABY, 3 years after Yavin. The punishment culture hadn't softened, hadn't rationalized, hadn't found a way to distinguish honest mistakes from treasonous incompetence. Failure meant death. Captain Needa died minutes later. His crime? Losing track of the Millennium Falcon in an asteroid field. The ship had hidden inside a space slug, and Needa's sensors couldn't find it. Again, a technical failure, not a moral one. The Falcon was a heavily modified freighter, piloted by one of the best smugglers in the galaxy. Losing it in an asteroid field wasn't incompetence. It was almost inevitable. Needa knew what was coming. He went to Vader personally to apologize, to accept responsibility, to shield his crew from collective punishment. The gesture was almost noble in its futility. Vader choked him to death and told the attending officers to apologize to Needa's men by disposing of his body. Neither Ozzel nor Needa had betrayed the Empire. Neither had aided the enemy. They'd simply produced results their superiors found unsatisfactory, and they died for it without trial or appeal. Now let's talk about the grunts, the people who don't get names in the histories, the ones whose survival wasn't important enough for Palpatine to punish personally, but who were punished anyway. Claudia Gray's novel Lost Stars, published in 2015, provides the perspective we've been missing, the view from the lower decks. The experience of ordinary Imperial personnel navigating a system designed to destroy them. Sienna Rhee was a young Imperial officer aboard the Star Destroyer Devastator, Vader's flagship during the Battle of Yavin. When the Death Star exploded, she was close enough to witness it, close enough to fly through the aftermath. The scene Gray describes is something the films never showed. The Devastator moved through the debris field of the destroyed station. 1 million people had been vaporized, but not completely, not cleanly. The explosion had scattered material across thousands of kilometers of space, and some of that material was recognizable. Bodies, fragments of bodies, pieces of stormtrooper armor with pieces of stormtroopers still inside. Chunks of organic matter mixed with twisted metal, frozen in the vacuum, tumbling endlessly through the void. The crew of the Devastator heard them, the bodies hitting the hull, soft impacts against the deflector shields, the random percussion of their dead comrades bouncing off the ship as they flew through the graveyard of the Death Star. No one spoke about it afterward. No one was permitted to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. The official position was that the Death Star's destruction was a temporary setback, that the Empire remained strong, that any discussion of the dead was defeatist thinking bordering on treason. But everyone heard the bodies. Everyone knew. And everyone understood what it meant, that they were expendable too. That if circumstances had been slightly different, a different duty rotation, a different assignment, a different ship, they'd be floating in that debris field, bouncing off the hull of a Star Destroyer while their former crewmates pretended not to hear. The psychological horror of that moment, flying through your dead colleagues, forbidden from mourning them, expected to continue serving the regime that had killed them, captures something essential about Imperial service. You weren't a person, you were a resource, and resources don't grieve. Apply the verified standards to anyone associated with the Death Star's destruction. The Lemlisk precedent proves that even building the weapon wasn't protection. The Vader precedent proves that even being second in command of the entire Empire wasn't protection. The Tagge precedent proves that even being right wasn't protection. The Ozzel and Nita precedents prove that relatively minor tactical errors, emerging from hyperspace incorrectly, losing a single ship in an asteroid field, warranted immediate execution. So what fate awaited a TIE pilot who survived when 1 million of his comrades died? What happened to the sensor officer whose station was destroyed before he could detect the approaching rebel fighters? What became of the logistics coordinator whose supply run kept him off the station that day? What about the maintenance technician who'd been transferred to a Star Destroyer the week before? The gunner who was on medical leave? The communications officer who'd rotated out? The documented punishments answer those questions without requiring speculation about specific individuals. The policy was clear. The precedents were established. The pattern was systematic. Records from the post-Yavin period show suspicious concentrations of combat casualties, training accidents, and reassignments to hazardous duty, affecting service members with any connection to the first Death Star. The bureaucratic machinery of military assignments could send inconvenient personnel to suicide missions without formally acknowledging punishment. A patrol route known for rebel ambushes. A garrison posting on a world scheduled for pacification operations. A transfer to Outer Rim territories where survival rates plummeted. Ground assault duty on hostile worlds. Escort missions for convoys that intelligence knew would be attacked. The cruelest aspect of this system was its administrative invisibility. Every order could be a death warrant disguised as routine rotation. Every superior could be an executioner operating through paperwork rather than blasters. You'd never know if you'd been marked for elimination until the ambush started or the training exercise went wrong. And if you did survive? If you somehow made it through the dangerous assignments and the suicide missions and the accidents, then you were evidence. Living proof that the system could fail, and the Empire couldn't tolerate evidence. And then there's Robot Chicken. June 17th, 2007. Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block. A sketch depicting Emperor Palpatine receiving a collect call from Vader after the Death Star's destruction. Seth MacFarlane voices Palpatine as an increasingly exasperated middle manager, learning his biggest project just exploded. Wait, what do you mean they blew up the Death Star? The disbelief escalates. The garbled communication on the line. Palpatine trying to understand what Vader is telling him. The frustration building and building until, what the hell is an aluminum falcon? That line became permanent fan vocabulary. It captured something true about the Empire that the films only implied: the gap between imperial majesty and corporate dysfunction. The facade of invincibility covering the same bureaucratic incompetence we recognize from our own workplaces, just scaled to genocide. The sketch works as comedic relief because it processes unbearable material through absurdity. After contemplating Lemlisk's piranha beetles and Vader's dismantlement and the systematic elimination of inconvenient survivors, we need a pressure valve. Robot Chicken provides it by reminding us that the Emperor's intimidating facade covered panic and frustration and the very human experience of having your biggest project fail spectacularly. The sketch spawned 2 sequel specials, embedded itself in fan discourse permanently, gave us permission to laugh at the Empire's dysfunction while also recognizing how terrifying that dysfunction was for anyone caught inside it. But the laughter shouldn't obscure the truth. Palpatine's reaction to the Death Star's destruction was fury beyond reason. Robot Chicken plays the rage for comedy. Bevel Lemlisk experienced the rage firsthand, 7 times. Here's what all of this reveals. Something fans have articulated for decades, finally laid out with the receipts. The Galactic Empire systematically brutalized its own personnel, with cruelty exceeding anything inflicted on declared enemies. Think about what the Rebel Alliance faced when captured: interrogation, imprisonment, perhaps execution. Princess Leia was tortured on the Death Star, but she survived. Han Solo was frozen in carbonite, but he survived. Rebel prisoners of war faced terrible treatment, but it was comprehensible treatment. Standard wartime cruelty that humans have inflicted on each other for millennia. Imperial personnel faced something far worse, because they'd never signed up to oppose anything. Lemlisk didn't join the rebellion. He built the Death Star. Vader didn't betray the Empire. He enforced its will for 2 decades. Tagge didn't make mistakes. He was right about everything and got promoted for it. Ozzel and Nita didn't aid the enemy. They made tactical errors that any commander might make. The unnamed pilots who survived Yavin hadn't fled their posts. They'd simply failed to die alongside their comrades. And for that, for surviving, they faced consequences worse than any enemy combatant could expect. The Empire punished its own more severely than its enemies, because surviving enemies were expected, while surviving failures were intolerable evidence that the system could break. The whole architecture was designed this way: fear cascading downward through every level of the hierarchy. Everyone afraid of the person above them. Everyone ready to sacrifice the person below them. No solidarity, no institutional loyalty, no sense that your service might actually protect you. Tarkin's doctrine was supposed to rule the galaxy through fear of the Death Star. But the real fear was internal. The real terror wasn't what the Empire might do to rebels. It was what the Empire would do to Imperials who failed. So let's go back to where we started. Man, that poor pilot got screwed. All he did was survive and is getting punished for it. That pilot, whoever he was, whatever happened to him, wasn't exceptional, wasn't unlucky in some cosmic sense. He was caught in a system designed to treat his survival as a crime. Because the Empire couldn't tolerate witnesses to its failures, every survivor was evidence that the Death Star could be destroyed. Every living Imperial from Yavin was a walking reminder that the regime's greatest achievement, 14 years of construction, resources from 1,000 star systems, the Tarkin doctrine made manifest, had been vaporized by a farm boy in an X-Wing. The bureaucratic solution was obvious: reassign, redeploy, eliminate. Make the inconvenient memories disappear through training accidents and hazardous duty, until no one remained who could remember what it felt like to watch 1,000,000 of their comrades die. Until no one was left who'd heard the bodies bouncing off the hull. Grand Moff Tarkin escaped all of this by dying in the explosion. His vaporization at Yavin was the only mercy the Empire ever provided: death before judgment, annihilation before the creative cruelty could begin. He died believing he was right. He died before Palpatine could prove him wrong. Cassio Tagge survived and was promoted and was right about everything, and still ended up dead at Vader's hands, because being correct doesn't matter when the system requires sacrifices. Darth Vader survived and was dismantled like a malfunctioning droid, forced to compete with laboratory-grown replacements, exiled to the volcanic hellscape where he'd lost his humanity, reminded that 20 years of service meant nothing when measured against a single failure. Bevel Lemlisk survived and died 7 times, eaten by beetles, burned alive, frozen in vacuum, drowned, crushed, poisoned, his consciousness preserved and transferred, and tortured until a New Republic firing squad finally gave him peace. Admiral Ozzel survived long enough to make one navigational error, and died clutching his throat on his own bridge. Captain Nita survived long enough to lose track of one freighter, and died apologizing for his failure. Sienna Ree survived flying through the debris field of 1,000,000 corpses, and spent years pretending she hadn't heard her dead comrades hitting the hull. The unnamed pilots and officers and technicians who survived Yavin, their fates weren't documented because they weren't important enough to document. They just disappeared, absorbed into a system that couldn't tolerate their existence, reassigned to death, filed away in the bureaucratic machinery of elimination. You were right to be frustrated. You were right to type that comment. The Empire didn't just do terrible things to its enemies. It saved its worst horrors for the people who served it. The cruelty wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. The fear wasn't collateral damage. It was the point. And now you've got the receipts. Subscribe for more stories like this.